All right. Can everyone hear me okay? Or can anyone not hear me okay? Perfect.
Yes.
Let me go ahead and share my screen. Does my screen come across clearly? It should say building a federal compliance program. Awesome. You guys are the best. All right, let's kick this off. The way that I kind of structured this talk, we'll be kind of going through, I really like to go over like shared definitions when talking about something to make sure like we're kind of talking about the same thing, because many words can have different meanings, especially in the cybersecurity space. So I went through like definitions we may want to like kind of revisit or go over, challenges learned, and then kind of like lessons learned in association with those challenges. And then we'll likely kind of like zoom in and out between the two, depending on which topic we're particularly on. So first introduction, I'm Lloyd Evans, Principal ISO over at Alleviate Inc. As Robert mentioned, we've been working together for a few times, and so he kind of gave me the push that I needed to really start, like speaking. And so my first topic was like, hey, well, one thing I know about is building a federal cloud compliance program for a platform as a service. So that's currently my current role as Principal ISO for a platform as a service within the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, or CMS. It's a really cool project called the Batcave project. Like the whole thing's Batman themed, and I really like the branding. It's really cool and builds a lot of team cohesion and has a lot of marketing benefits. A little bit about my background: I'm an Air Force veteran. I race Ironman triathlons in my free time, or at least like try to. I'm not very good, but I just try to finish. And then I have 3 dogs: Weimaraner, Pitbull, Great Pyrenees, and a brand new Dalmatian we've had for like 3 months. He just turned a year old. So they're a lot. And my girlfriend and I have them just north of Austin, Texas. All right, so starting with our first definition, one, cloud compliance. I really liked Trend Micro's definition that they have in terms of their call out, where it's like kind of like an art and a science. I really resonate with that. It's definitely been a mix of both. So we'll kind of get into the particular specifics between the two. And Robert, I think you're, am I feedbacking on myself? Oh, okay, that's Joe. Perfect. So I really like this definition for cloud compliance, and we'll dive in further. A couple things, just a quick recap for anyone who may not be familiar: SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS. I'll kind of go this like out of order, but starting with SaaS applications, it's essentially when the provider like takes care of like the application all the way from the infrastructure all the way to the application delivery for you. So some examples would be like Gmail, G Suite, things you're very familiar with, where the user, it pretty much just controls like the data that goes into the application, and then like certain levels of like access privileges involved with configuring the application as well. Jumping down to an IaaS, that's kind of like the like AWS model, where an infrastructure company like abstracts away the physical infrastructure, so you no longer have to deal with anything like data warehouse requirements, anything like that. Like making sure servers are kept up to date, that kind of thing. All that's abstracted away, and then the customer can build whatever they want on top of that using the like IaaS services that whatever provider you have provides. So platform as a service, or PaaS, is somewhere in between the two, usually built on top of an IaaS. It's essentially like a complete development environment that really tries to abstract away as much of the underlying infrastructure as possible, so that application developers who enter your platform as a service can build their applications and move to prod much faster. And this is particularly relevant in the federal space, where application developers might not necessarily have the like full resourcing, or really want to kind of like match the level of compliance burden or requirements overheads that are involved with bringing an application to production within the federal sector. All right, so this graphic I think really helps. It's just a very simple one from Microsoft Azure. So kind of going to that IaaS, subtracting the data center away. PaaS is like somewhere in between the two, and then SaaS is kind of that like full application where you're just in charge of the data that goes into it, and then like who has access to it. We may be referring to this we may be referring back to this at some point. And do want to do a quick call out. So we're going to cover a lot of ground on this. So like some of these slides alone could have their own presentations within themselves. So we'll definitely have questions afterwards. I have not clocked how long this presentation takes quite yet, so we'll get there. But there will be room for questions at the end. All right, so challenges. These are the challenges we'll be going through. I won't spend too much time diving into these, but just kind of like a high level overview of what we'll be looking for coming up here. So first off, security and compliance, or security versus compliance. One of the challenges that we've kind of found is like when you're building a cloud compliance program, that's not actually everything that needs to be done to effectively secure like your platform or your particular like system. This is definitely something to like call out two things when prioritizing, and then when communicating with like stakeholders, business people who aren't like super in the weeds of like security, like maybe like you or I were kind of like nerd about this kind of thing. But this has definitely been one of the challenges that we've kind of had to figure out like what works best for us in terms of communicating like, hey, we have these compliance requirements, but in the federal sector, those requirements haven't necessarily kept up with like all of the like really fast moving efforts in terms of like software development. So when you try and like marriage something where it's like very like configuration management controls that were written like 10, 15, 20 years ago to something like Kubernetes, which is only like less than a decade old in terms of at least like, you know, the public's use of it, it could have some like interesting dynamics. And so keeping in mind that like, hey, we have these compliance requirements, we do need to meet them to kind of like, you know, move forward into production in the federal sector. But at the same time, there's also all these other security engineering requirements under that like capital S security, as I like to call it, that we want to like balance prioritization towards. And so when you're building out your cloud compliance program, that's like one thing to like keep in mind is one, making sure that both those efforts are really in alignment, and then two, they just be like really being mindful of all the like additional security engineering things that are just as critical as your compliance requirements to securing the data that you need to secure. So some lessons learned from this, at least from what we found. I still a lot of leadership lessons from Jocko Willink, who's a Navy SEAL commander. One of his lessons is decentralized command. So we've had a lot of success in embedding security personnel across like our different value streams. So we have like infrastructure, pipeline, embedding like security personnel where, hey, they live and breathe what the infrastructure team is doing, what those like engineers are doing, so that they're like very like knowledgeable and like in the weeds on that particular value stream. And then this really only works if you have like very like high levels of communication between all the embedded security leads. So I think we've done this like very well, and I think some of the benefits that it has is almost like a are very clear if you kind of like look at towards the opposite is. So a very like centralized security team can often have like large levels of difficulty in terms of staying in touch with what the engineering teams are doing. And then you kind of get like that back and forth where it's like an engineering team that comes and like, hey, we have this full like architecture thing that we want to move forward to. Is this secure? Or is this good to go? And you're like, oh, like I'm just now, you know, like looking at this for the first time when like you've been working on this for like a few months now. So there's definitely like a like really hard like pains and challenges associated with that. Whereas like if you have a security person embedded on that team, it's like, hey, infra is currently having this particular pain point that's being like risen. So like, you know, me who's not embedded on like the infrastructure team necessarily can really like see like that dynamic at play and like keep in tune as well as like across the different value streams. That is something we have had a large amount of success on in terms of marrying the compliance requirements with the engineering that's going on with the security engineering that needs to be done to safeguard the I guess the main engineering. So yeah. Compliance requirements. This is something that was a little easy for us in terms of our particular situation as a platform, but may or may not be easy depending on where you're at in the federal sector. So one thing that we relied on was NIST 153 Rev 5. We used an overlay of that since like within the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, not to get too much into it, but there's like some privacy requirements associated with like that kind of data. And so we used an overlay that included those. And like that was our specific like requirements in terms of like pursuing an ATO or authority to operate. Authority to operate is essentially like a very long federal process to go from like not having a system to having a system in production and everything in between. So one, identify all relevant compliance requirements that may or may, that's kind of like a continuous thing too, I do want to call out. So like for one, too, even like clarity and like what exactly is involved in an ATO, we were definitely like getting more and more clear as we were going through our process. And so it's kind of like, oh, like, you know, maybe this particular piece of information or this requirement would have been nice to know earlier, but that's just not the way it played out, and just being like okay with that essentially. So doing the best you can to get all the relevant ones you need to up front, and then making sure that you're identifying things. And this includes things coming down the pipe too. You know, not everything is like immediate in terms of what's like priority in terms of maturity model. So things coming down the pipe like zero trust or alignment with the like latest White House executive order, you know, kind of like pushing SBOMs, like compliance with that. You want to make sure that you're like developing your immediate needs, but also developing your roadmap. So for us, what that looked like is one, get an authority to operate, and then two, really like push more of like an ongoing authorization or continuous ATO model post that, depending on your level of familiarity with that. I'm not sure we'll go too in the weeds on that, but we may return to that in the future. All right, definitions, security control. So when you're dealing with NIST 853 Rev 5, or really any other revisions, there's these things called security controls within them, which is essentially like a particular safeguard or like requirement measure that your system needs to adhere to in order to be compliant with that particular control. So this is what this kind of looks like, at least for us. One thing you may notice a little different about this particular security control from security controls within NIST 853 is that 853 kind of writes these without the organizational specifics. So if, I'm not sure if my cursor appears on the screen, but if you look under like H1, where it says like 30 days when accounts are no longer required, like a NIST 853 might say, it might not say 30 days. It might just say like per a timeline determined by your organization or something like that. So that was one of the benefits of us. We just had those baked into our policies. So that was pretty cool. But then you have your like control family. There's 20 of them, at least for the requirements that we had to adhere to. I think there's a few more maybe under NIST. I'm not 100% sure on that. Control number, it's like which particular control it is on the control family, control name, what the control is, and then all of the requirements to be able to meet that control. So for this one, I chose this one in particular because it is lengthy. There is quite a few like control elements underneath this particular control you have to meet. And then as a platform, you have to write like how you're meeting each one of those controls. And then it extends a bit beyond that. Hopefully I wrote that somewhere. We'll get to control inheritance eventually, but not on this slide. So mapping a platform to a control framework. There's a couple approaches that you can do this. One is tool-centric and one is control-centric. And a better way to picture this, and if I have one failing in putting this deck together, it's not enough pictures. So I'm going to try and explain this as well as I can. So for our particular baseline, for our particular solution, we were working at a, let's call it like a moderate control baseline. So we had about 350 so odd of these types of controls at very like kind of differing levels of complexity that we had to meet as a program. And then those break down to like just shy of 800 control elements, like kind of as listed here. And then you have to have statements for how the platform fulfills the control, as well as what we're all trying to get at here, which is value to our customers in terms of security control inheritance. So that's a like kind of like at face value, that's quite a bit of work in terms of mapping all of the engineering that's going on in terms of building a platform to less than or just shy of like 800 control elements, and then doing so of like delineating the responsibilities of like, hey, how does your platform meet these versus like what kind of control inheritance can you offer to your customers? I think I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. All right, I'm going to take a brief, I'm going to go a little bit farther ahead and then we're going to come back. So quick recap on security controls inheritance. So going back to this particular diagram, and the best way I can describe this is like for an IaaS, there's like a whole like maintenance control family, which says like, hey, you have to maintain the actual infrastructure that you're using as a part of your system. Well, if AWS is doing all of the maintenance and all that kind of the physical security for their infrastructure, doing like failover, everything involved in that. You know, I, as a customer of them, don't necessarily have to worry about IaaS. Like that is abstracted to me from a security controls perspective. And for a PaaS, what we're essentially doing is extending that security controls inheritance and maximizing that as far as we can beyond the IaaS to ensure that our customer who are building and developing their applications can have as reduced a compliance burden as possible, like given just what based on exactly what the platform is offering. So going back to here, how do you do that and like how do you start? So one, you could go through all 353 controls and go line by line and say like, hey, we have ACO2. You know, what do we have that maps to this? And it's definitely a valid way to do it. We ran into some large difficulties in doing that, where like as you're building the platform, you may not meet like half of these particular controls quite yet, or maybe like a little unclear where it's like, hey, we have a plan for this, but like we haven't implemented yet. And so we found that you can get like really lost in the weeds going control by control. So instead what we did was kind of the opposite, where we had these things called architecture decision records, or like ADRs. It's essentially like a you know, we knew we had a functional capability for our architecture that we wanted to fill, think like SAS scanning or like static security analysis. And we knew we wanted this particular capability. And then we went through an architecture decision record, which detailed like, hey, we're choosing a tool for this capability based on, a number of factors that were very relevant to stakeholders, what makes sense for architecture, and then input from the very, very smart individuals on our team. So we're like, hey, we have all these architecture decision records detailing out what we're building our platform with. Let's tie these components to controls and kind of go about it from like a tool-centric approach. And that seemed to work very well for us. There's actually some additional benefits we'll get to later on involved with this approach as well. So instead of going like AC2, AC3, AC4, what happens here? We went, hey, we're using this particular tool for our like authentication. Like what of these 350 controls, like what controls map to that particular tool in terms of that capability. Now, there are some caveats to this where one of the things that's required to this, and we'll go into the lessons learned, is that second thing here is like this definitely requires like upskilling or like the kind of like that decentralized approach like within the team to make sure that you're actually like you know what the tool is capable of to be able to map. So like this could be pretty easy for some tools that we're all maybe like familiar with. So like take like Okta for authentication, for example. Like a lot of people have familiarity with Okta, relatively easy to spin up. If you're building a platform though, and there's like dozens of tools, many of which you have no familiarity with before, it's definitely kind of like a balance to spin up on like, hey, what exactly does this tool do? How is it fitting into our larger architecture? And then building that out enough of your own understanding to then be able to communicate effectively with your engineers. So going back to our lessons learned. So we started with casting a wide net in terms of starting with that tool-centric approach. So it's like, hey, of these 350 controls, like if anything could potentially relate to Okta, let's gather that up. And if it's like 50 odd controls, like if there's any like I'm not sure what an analogy would be, but like if any control could potentially relate, like just bring it in, map it there, and then we'll start to carve these down and like dial things in as we go along. And that really, really helped us focus is like the biggest thing. So then once we had that like short list of things that potentially map to like that particular tool, we could then go in and really maximize the value of the time that we had with our engineering teams to dial in where it's like, hey, this particular tool, we're doing these controls, let's carve it down to like what actually like maps based on what the tool is doing, not what the tool is capable of doing. One of the things we wanted to really keep in clear was like value to customer. We've seen some where it's like, hey, you could map like the totality of what like a tool like Okta does to the ARS controls, but like if we're not using those features, like how is that relevant to our customers? Like we want to focus on exactly what benefits they're going to be getting in terms of going back to, I lost my diagram. Oh no. Okay. So be comfortable with casting wide net, then dialing in, map what the tool does, not what the tool is capable of, and then ensure statements are in line with what is actually configured. This is very, very challenging. And we will get to this probably on the next slide, where it really depends on building trust with your engineering teams. Quick side note, going this approach in terms of using like an NIST 853 overlay had a lot of like side benefits. And one of those is being able to establish like what policies and procedures that we needed, at least from a compliance standpoint. Very, very helpful in terms of like when you're building out a compliance standpoint, you can kind of have like a sea of choices where it's like, I know we need an incident response plan, and you can like say that for a bunch of different like policies and procedures that you may need, but like, how do you know exactly what you need beyond that? And NIST 853 wasn't a total solution, but it was a nice benchmark of saying like, hey, here's all these like policies and procedures that you'll need from a compliance standpoint. And then you can build on top of that, like what's relevant, what's needed for your kind of going back to that like capital S, like what's needed beyond just your compliance requirements for an effective program. All right, so that leads us to maintaining good relationships with developers. This was very critical in terms of going back to that challenge of ensuring statements are in line with what is actually configured. And there's actually a lot more that goes into this and probably could have its own presentation in and of itself. But sticking to kind of like the basics here of what like we found was very valuable was one, focus on delivering value over getting lost in the weeds. you could definitely like really lose people like going through like 800 elements in terms of like they're all very particular, and you could easily like eyes could easily glaze over. So focus on like what is driving value to our customers, and then not doing it in like iterations and cycles. Also really helped in terms of saying like, hey, like maybe we don't have this process quite built out now, let's document what we do have and then return to this later. Another thing that also helped is doing as much as possible in terms of a lift and kind of like that upskilling approach beforehand. So in my own personal experience, I had very little experience with infrastructure as code. We were using infrastructure as code. So I spent a lot of time researching and diving into Terraform and being able to have enough of a conversation in terms of like how our files were configured and being able to like follow along with exactly what's happening, which led to a lot more valuable conversations with our developers and a lot less hand-holding of them hand-holding me through this process. Which I felt really, really helped. And that's just like my particular example. Everyone that was assisting with this on our team has their own example of like, in terms of learning something that they definitely weren't familiar with before, and then like really upskilling and then becoming decently competent, if not from a creative perspective, definitely from a being able to like read perspective. And then, so eventually, starting with that tool-centric approach like really works well, but eventually you're gonna have to go back to that control-centric approach. So as you dial things in, kind of reeling that like wide net that we initially cast, you'll start to realize like, hey, like, okay, maybe we have 4 tools that really knock out most of the access control family, and maybe we have 10 controls left that still remain where nothing's been mapped to that. Now you can go through and like look at each one of those particular controls and say like, hey, what might fit here? Maybe there's maybe you overlooked something, so it's an easy way to like kind of like double check. Maybe you have new thoughts where it's like, hey, we're now using this thing that we weren't using before. You can bring that in. Maybe you just have a better understanding of exactly like what certain things are doing, and you can fill things in that way. That seems to work best for us though. And then again, just to reiterate, document what is and what is to be done like immediately in terms of like a notes tracking, not what we would like things to be. That's very, very critical. Kind of went over this. Lessons learned on security control inheritance. So just to recap, security control inheritance. So not only do we have to meet all these controls for a platform, we're trying to deliver value to our customers. So how many of these can we offer inheritance for? And inheritance being like, hey, we are taking responsibility of this particular control. Let's say it's AC2. Maybe we're taking control over all of that control. Maybe we're taking over particular elements, or maybe we're sharing those between us where it's like, we do this part of this like particular controller element, but you also have to do this part, and detailing out that responsibility delineation. So lessons learned from that process: one, maintain really good customer focus of delivering value. And that's something that we've seen in terms of like detail is good in terms of delivering that value. Detail also makes it very tough for audits. So it's this dichotomy or this like line that you kind of have to go through and really balance between in order to get that in well. That definitely takes like the more iterations you're able to produce through these controls, given like your whatever time constraints you have, the better. But that's something that we discovered. Feedback is critical from stakeholders. If you can get access to like someone who's been through audits, that's very, very helpful, as well as feedback from customers is probably the most critical thing. And that's been one thing that we've been very, very happy to hear is like, showing like what we've done to our customers and saying like, hey, these are really, really good. That's been like really, really good feedback from them. This ever absolutely takes a team. I'm fortunate enough to have a great team like assist me through this journey, and I would definitely recommend, if you're like engaging in this work, scoping out a team to help with this. This is not a one person job. Responsibilities need to be clear. Some responsibilities need to be very clear. This is definitely something that I think becomes more apparent later on in the mapping and writing process in terms of building out that compliance program, is you really start to realize that there are certain things or responsibility delineations that you should really be having with included in early customers conversations with your customers, because they could have really large potential downline effects of like whatever particular journey they're entering in with your platform. All right, so growing your cloud compliance program. So for our particular journey, we were on an authority to operate journey, and then moving to continuous authority to operate or ongoing authorization, depending on how familiar you are with that. So one of like our major, like probably that control mapping was like one of the most like major lifts of achieving the ATO was making sure we had statements for all 800 of those controls. And that was dictated by our security requirements. If you're in a potentially different situation, definitely the workload may not be that big. But again, that comes back to that like customer focus, where it's like, we found our value streams in terms of delivering this value to our customers, because the way that we were thinking about it was like every control that we're writing and having an actual technical capability that we are taking off there, or like, I guess every control that we are able to provide like full or partial inheritance for is less of a compliance burden that our customers have to go through, and they can just focus on developing their application. Eventually. So one of the things that I kind of teed up earlier and kind of lost was that tool-centric approach also really, really helps with moving to kind of like a documentation as code. So instead of having like, a really long like PDF system security plan, or like keeping all these controls in like some kind of like Excel file or however you like contain them, moving to a tool-centric really, really helps with converting to like OSCAL. And I think I have a quick slide which like shows an example of OSCAL. So OSCAL is I'm not exactly sure who owns the push right now, but it's essentially like the controls and control statements that like we kind of just went over, except like in a particular like OSCAL format. So you can see here you have your like title, like CA05, like the particular control, and then the actual like control like guidelines that it has, and then I think somewhere in here you should be able to put like the actual like language of the statement that you have. This makes it much easier to maintain and manage once you can get the once you can actually like transfer everything over to OSCAL, which is a journey in and of itself. This makes it much easier to manage, especially with really innovative GRC platforms that have been really pioneering in this space. So in terms of growing a cloud compliance program, something too is building streamlined manual processes, then automating what you can. So in terms of our journey, most things that we write, you'll notice like most of the things in terms of like interviews with developers, like in terms of over the shoulder, like configuration, I guess like checks to make sure the statements are accurate. A lot of that is manual. In terms of growing your cloud compliance program, like you don't want all those things to be manual. So along the way, keeping in mind where it's like, hey, maybe there's better ways that we can tie our Terraform scripts to configuration management controls, and like kind of like automate that documentation process rather than continuing through with particular interviews. And at least in my opinion, building those like streamlined manual processes first allows you to then automate kind of what it is, rather than just saying like, hey, automate everything and being very unclear of what exactly that means. And then two, always sharing growth and understanding with your engineers, with your stakeholders, with your leadership about like, hey, here's why we're doing the things we're doing, here's why it's important, here's how it fits in the larger picture. Now, all of what I've just said predicates on is leadership. This has been one of the biggest keys in terms of growing a cloud compliance program. This could be its own presentation in and of itself. Some of the leadership principles that I really used in terms of my own particular journey. I stole all but one of these from Jocko Willink's book Extreme Ownership as well. One, belief. Belief is really underrated. If you balked at oh my gosh, 800 control elements, we have to map that to dozens of tools, and then come up with multiple statements based on how we do it as a platform and how our customers gain value from it. You have to believe you can do that, and that's definitely something that you hammer on, where it's hey, chipping away definitely takes a level of patience to get to the end, but you have to believe it can be done, and that's the first step, and keeping that belief alive with the team. Two, keep things simple. It is very easy to overcomplicate everything that I just said, and so we really tried to keep things simple, one, by focusing on our customers, and then two, really sticking to kind of what actually is creating value, whether it's internal value in terms of simple processes and not overcomplicating things, or external value in terms of taking that compliance burden off of our customers. I'm going to skip, or I guess in that too, there's a lot of ambiguity. Controls aren't very clear. They were definitely not written for modern software development, at least from a like from our experience with NIST 853. So in that ambiguity, like be decisive in uncertainty, like be willing to say like, hey, here's our best guess. You know, we pulled together everyone that needs to be pulled together to be able to weigh in on like a particular decision. We've routed it appropriately. Let's move forward and, you know, be confident. And then, you know, if we have to you know, pivot either due to customer feedback or to, you know, maybe that doesn't stand up in like an audit or something like that, you know, that's fine. But like, we're going to move forward because this is a large chunk of work to get through. And you can always, you can always pivot later, essentially. So move forward, fail fast, that kind of mentality. In line with simple too, like system scale. I really tried to keep this one as like a core tenet of like, if you're going to do something twice, then you're going to do a lot of times. So even in that like whole process of like controls mapping, implementation statement writing, a lot of the things that we've gone over, even to an extent like policies, where it's like building those systems in such a way where, you know, you can teach someone else to then do it, where it's like, you know, once you do that, then it's like you can, if you're going to the tool-centric approach, and everyone's understanding like the systems by which you're going about creating out you know, your like compliance standards, then you can say like, hey, I'm going to teach you how to do this for this one tool, and now you are by extension like a multiplier in terms of being able to assist out in terms of building this compliance program. And then all of that comes down to teamwork. It definitely takes a team, not only with your security teams who's building out the cloud compliance program, but, you know, teamwork with your developers, teamwork in terms of relaying certain like deadlines and milestones with leadership, and then teamwork in terms of being able to understand like cloud compliance is only one aspect of like delivering the full value of a PaaS, and then making sure that it's like you know, appropriate in terms of that journey in a whole. So thank you for coming and listening to my talk. Again, we recapped building a federal cloud compliance program for a PaaS. And now open for any questions.
Well, everybody else seems to be on mute. I'll jump in here. Hi, Lloyd. Tim Johnson from Cloudbees. Couple of questions. I mean, you know, from what I understand, a continuous ATO, I can't remember what agency are issuing is the memo says, you know, you need to have a reference architecture that you work from. You need to have ongoing visibility, and then you have to have compensating controls in order to achieve continuous ATO. Where did you work in the compensating controls, and how do you know when to trigger those?
That's a good question. What we kind of did was we tied in with current there was a ongoing authorization or continuous authority to operate, whichever one you want to call it. Like, we tied in with those efforts that were already existing within Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, and they had already started to build out like certain requirements in terms of exactly what you're talking about, of like saying like, hey, like what kind of I forget the exact language used, but the like compensating controls that you need to adhere to in order to move on to like their version of ongoing authorization. I think one of the things the platform really enables is the ability. So like we're using like Kubernetes, right? And within Kubernetes, you have like an emission controller, tools out there like Caverno. I forget what the other one is. I forget, but a lot of what we're doing is tying like value streams that we can have continuous diagnostics and monitoring like within our platform, beyond kind of because like within a normal ATO, there's not a whole lot of like continuous like ATO it's like related controls, and so that's like part of our journey is like we went through one, like get our ATO, map everything there, and then two, align with organizational efforts and like what's required to move to like an ongoing authorization. And then there's even like a third level there of like three, how can we innovate on top of that and provide further value, because the goal for us at least is to move all of our customer base also to like a continuous authority to operate model. I don't know if that answered your question, but
yeah, so to an extent. So how do you know? Well, a couple things. How do you know if particular controls have been met, and how do you teach the different developers how and when and where to use it and the context with the result that may come back from that particular control or that particular test. And so
Yeah. Okay.
here's our controls. How do you know anybody's doing it?
I'm tracking now. So there's kind of like a twofold approach that we've gone through it. It's like one, this kind of goes to that like build streamlined manual processes and then automate like everything you can on top of that. So one, we were building out like for the ATO where it's just like, hey, the initial thing is just like over the shoulders where it's like working with our developer who's configuring Terraform. It's like, hey, like show me your Terraform scripts. All right, like making sure that those are in alignment, but like there's a natural configuration drift. And this is like one of the main issues with kind of like ATO cycles is that if you're assessing things on like a multi-year cycle, you're gonna have like major configuration drift even like months later after that initial assessment. So one thing in terms of the manual portion is like building I don't know what you want to call it, like a continuous compliance like program or something like that. And this is something we're currently working on where it's like really narrowing down that cycle time that controls are updated in line with the actual infrastructure. And there's a couple mechanisms you can do this with. One is, like customer feedback too, like listen to your customers in terms of like, hey, like we want more clarity on this particular control because like what we're seeing on the ground level doesn't necessarily match up with like what our ISO is seeing like from a compliance perspective, and then tackling things and addressing things that way. And then two, really being like keyed into like any kind of like architecture changes, whether that's like updating like for us like our ADRs or something that we've done to kind of keep track too is like implementing security analysis templates into pull request templates, and then having developers like kind of like think through early on in the development process if any changes they'll make will have maybe like potential downline security effects, and then maintaining in between those. And then I think in terms of that like automation piece of like preventing that configuration drift, that's on a control by control basis, and that is a very difficult piece where it's like certain controls the way that they're written, it's like very tough to figure out how you might automate that, especially things that relate to documentation. At the same time, there are controls that are ambiguous enough to where you can say like, hey, for this particular control, it's written in a way where we have control over how that's fulfilled. So how we're going to fulfill it is something that's more in line with like continuous diagnostics mitigation. I don't know if that answers your question either, but.
Okay. But okay, so how do you provide evidence? Where's the receipts that yea, verily we are compliant?
That is a good question. So one thing I would like to add on to that too is like what receipts are you required to have? So that was one thing without getting into like too much specifics where it's like for our like ATO process, it's like very, very specific. Like everything is very dialed in. ATO processes are like very traditional and they have their own kind of particular way of evidence gathering that like from a compliance standpoint, we're definitely adhering to and going through that process to make sure that we're doing what's required from their evidence requirement standpoint. Two, from an ongoing authorization perspective, you have things like it's escaping me off the top of my head. It will come to me. You have certain AWS tools, I think, that you can use to provide evidence, at least from the AWS side.
Okay. Well, I'm monopolizing time here. I'm sure other people have questions, so I'll step back.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions? Okay. Tim, do you have another one?
I think I'm good for now.
Okay. Very good.
Tim, we can always follow up on that one too, because I could track that down for you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, yes, please. We'll follow up. My other colleague, Richard, on here will probably reach out to you.
Absolutely.
All right. Excellent. All right. I want to go ahead and stop our recording.